Good morning. We're here to talk about project management decisions. This is Dr. DATTA. Project decision making should begin with understanding the project timeline, which is shown right out here. So the project timeline basically shows time, x-axis, and the importance of certain characteristics, or y-axis. But here's how it starts. You begin with starting the project, organize and prepare, carry out all the project work. You control scope, you control resources, you control various degrees of risk, and then you finally close the project. Now, as you move forward, you begin with a project charter. So these are typically the documents. These are the documents, and these are the stages. So the stages are start project, organize, prepare, carry out project work, close the project. Your documents would be project charter, your project management plan, the deliverables accepted by the customer, and then project documents for internal consumption. As this happens, you'll find that certain activities of the project, the importance changes over time. Firstly, what drops is the influence of stakeholders and the uncertainty, because you start with a lot of unknowns, and as your project moves forward and possibly orders more and more modular deliverables, what you're doing is you're checking off one box after another in terms of how you're reaching closer and closer to the entire definition and scope of your project. So uncertainty decreases, as does the influence of stakeholders. What increases, on the other hand, is the cost of changes. It's very important for you to realize that as you move forward, further down the project, changing something becomes very expensive because it impacts everything else that you had previously done, and changing one thing might require changing 50 other things, which basically means plan yourself properly and plan ahead. The third thing is project cost and staffing level. Because the cost of changes also increases, what also increases with it is, with or without changes in place, project cost increases mainly in this section where you're carrying out the centerpiece of the project work. As you're doing that, you're creating more and more deliverables, finishing more and more deliverables and milestones. In the process, you're instituting more resources, dedicating more time, assuming more costs. So this is the section where costs go up till, of course, your main deliverables are done and your internal organizational deliverables need to be completed, and that's when the cost falls. So once again, important to realize the documents over time, over the timeline: project charters, management plan, deliverables accepted by the customer, and project documentations both for internal consumption as well as external consumption. The stages are the starting of a project, the organization and preparation, the carrying out of the project work, and then the closing of the project. Over that time, uncertainty decreases and the influence of stakeholder decreases as you move forward. Cost increases, especially at the point where you're delivering a lot of these project specifications and modular outcomes. And finally, very important to realize is the cost of a project will always go up as you try to implement something new at the end of the project. So if you want to implement a change, the cost of the project will keep going up. Now, in the same process, we have to talk about the triple constraints of project management. Now, the original constraint began with schedule, scope, and budget, which is also cost. As simply put, all it meant was that if you wanted to increase the scope of your project, the scope of your project would be all the features, all the things you want to deliver in that project. If you say I want to add more features to it, it's going to take you more time. More time, it basically means more schedule. More schedule automatically means your costs are going up, which basically means that if you want to increase the scope, you also have to increase the costs for your project. So know what to budget as you move forward. In the same vein, the three new things that are added here are resources, quality, and risk. Now, resources, quality, and risk are very interesting research or very interesting elements that add to this to our understanding of project management decision making. But what it doesn't tell you is the fact that greater risk automatically means, or if you want to reduce risk, you have to increase your time. You need to increase your time, you need to increase your costs, and you need to increase the number of resources in the process. If you want to increase resources are always costly. Resources take time. And then quality. If you want to increase quality, increasing quality means you want to reduce the risks. If you want to reduce risk, you need more resources. Therefore, quality also requires more resources. Resources need more cost. Resources need more time. And adding more resources will also increase scope. So you realize that they're all very closely interrelated, but these are interesting elements to consider, which are understand time, the schedule, understand scope, the extent of the deliverables, and understand the budget, the cost. In the same way, also understand the resources that you need to run the project, the risks that you want to mitigate as you're going through the project, and the quality you want to deliver as you move through the project. So here's an interesting question for you. Can you, separately in your own time, can you model all the constraints for a project across a project's life cycle? You could do it for your own department, you could do it for your own project, you could do it for your own set of deliverables or achievables that you want to consider, but can you work itself through? And as you work yourself through, you might want to pay close attention to all the 6 pieces and ask yourself, how much time will I need for each of these deliverables? How much budget? How much scope? How many resources? How much risk control? And how much quality? The second bit of this puzzle is based on understanding the project management framework, which is a very important thing to understand because it suddenly puts into a perspective all of the things we mentioned and a few others across the life cycle of the project. Now, the run of the project, it moves from initiation to planning to executing to monitoring and controlling to closing. So the execution to monitoring to closing is typically the place where your costs go up. Remember, if we were to retrace it, your costs went up and then went down. Now, in the same vein, as you're developing your project charters, developing your project management plan, directing and managing project work, monitoring and controlling project work, and creating integrated change control, which is you're integrating things, you're making sure that one change here is reflected somewhere else so that nothing goes iffy later on. And then when you're closing the projects and delivering the documentation, that's those are the main integration pieces of the puzzle. If you look at scope, you'll see that the scope piece comes the most in the planning stage, where you're planning the scope, your plans, your scope management strategy. You talk about um, requirements gathering or requirements engineering or requirements collection. You define the scope and you create your work breakdown, schedule or work breakdown structure, which shows you what are the things you need over what time at what stage, and we'll see that in a little bit. Scope again comes back when you're monitoring and controlling, where you're validating your scope and you're controlling your scope. Time. Here you're talking about in the planning stage, a lot of time allocation goes into that, where you're planning your schedule management, you're defining activities, you're understanding the sequence of activities. What do we need to do when and after what or before what in order to get things done? Estimating activity resources, and to realize this is an estimation, which basically means you're trying to forecast or predict how much of resources you're likely to need. Very important to know is estimate more. So estimate more when uncertainty is greater. So whenever you have more uncertainty, your estimation goes up because it's more difficult to predict when you don't know things very well. Therefore, always factor in some degree of extra cost whenever it's more difficult to predict. Same thing goes with estimate activity durations. If you don't really know, if you have uncertainty, estimate a longer period of time and then you develop your schedule. Time returns again when you're doing your schedule control and monitoring and controlling. Now, I personally look at monitoring and controlling as something that's spread across the whole project or across the whole project timeline, because monitoring and controlling allows you to audit changes, audit developments, audit estimations, among many other things. But let's assume that monitoring and controlling is being done at the end, and this is how we'll follow it, at least for this slide. If you look at costs, costs out here are also we've mentioned how important cost is, and we all know that cost is not the easiest thing to manage in the world, especially when you're dealing with large projects. Loads of uncertainty, where estimation of costs also follows the same schedule. Anytime you have uncertainty, all your project dimensions, from resource allocation to quality fluctuation to risk to cost to scope to time, they're always likely to they're likely to go up. The other thing is you're also planning your cost management and you're determining your budget. And of course, your cost control comes into your controlling and monitoring setup. Under quality, this is where you plan your quality management, which is also a very important thing to tie quality to scope. You need to first ensure quality first, then define the scope. If you try to do it the other way around, you're likely to get into an issue where your scope has been defined, but you suddenly realize, based on your scope definition, your quality might suffer. So begin with quality and then go down the list any other way you want to. Similarly, human resources. So again, when you're doing quality, when you're during the period of when you're executing the projects, make sure that you have your quality assurance bits running. You're controlling for quality. Under human resources, you're planning your human resources at the planning stage. You're acquiring your project team, developing your project team, and managing your project team during the execution stage. Under communications, you're planning your communications management, managing communications, and you're controlling communications. Under risk, which oftentimes is a very interesting piece of the puzzle, companies might find it beneficial to consider quality and risk as paired combinations, which basically means you want to increase quality while decreasing risk, which means you're planning everything from initiation to planning to executing to controlling, monitoring to closing have to work off maximize quality and minimize risk. So risk here again, you plan your risk management, identify your risks, perform qualitative risk analysis, which basically means understand things like a qualitative analysis would mean understanding things that are more subjective in nature, which is who might be the people who might create problems. Is it possible that when I'm moving or when I'm getting something from another country, we might have some cultural issues that might suddenly stall the project? Could there be other issues like corruption and bribery across borders? Internally, could there be some people who will be absolutely resistant to any changes and create so many problems? Those are the qualitative components. The quantitative components are much more objective nature, which is you could look at currency headwinds, you could look at things such as any kind of arbitrage opportunities or the loss of arbitrage opportunities, tax areas, whether there are certain new tariffs that are coming into play, whether there are certain specific increases in labor costs that could impact you. But those are things that are much more objective, and that's your quantitative, while qualitative would be more subjective assessments. Then, of course, you control risks in the monitoring and controlling phase. Under procurement, you plan your procurement management and you conduct your procurement and you control your procurement and you close all your procurements. So that moves from planning to execution to monitoring and controlling to closing. And finally, with stakeholders, you identify your stakeholders first. That's in the initiation project, and this is important. Understand stakeholders as people who are both going to be directly as well as indirectly involved with the project, which means that you don't always want them to be accountable, but you want them to be responsible. But you all, but the people who are indirectly involved as stakeholders, it might be a good idea to keep them informed in the process. Then, of course, you plan your stakeholder management in terms of what happens if we don't find this? Who would be a go to person? How would we build those sets? You manage your stakeholder engagement, who does what, at what level, and then you control your stakeholder engagement. So the entire framework moves from all these elements that are needed across the project, from integration to scope to time to cost, quality, human resources, communications, risk, procurement, stakeholders, and the phases: initiation, planning, execution, monitoring, controlling, closing, and how their roles and your timeline requires you to pay certain attention to what to do at what stage for what particular element. Once again, a good thing to start off with is quality, or sometimes quality and risk at the same time. So, very important pieces of the puzzle: quality and risk. You want to increase quality, reduce risk. Based on that, you now define your scope, your time, your costs, your human resources, your communications, procurement, stakeholders, and finally, last but not least, integration. Next, we begin with quick um, workflow and flowchart structure for project scope management and entire project management. Now, this section of developing a project charter is what comes out of the organization whole. So the project charter comes out of the organization, as does the whole idea of organizational process assets, right? So as you're developing your project charter and to create the project charter and creating your list of assets that you need, they both come out from the enterprise or your company. Without assets, without a charter, a charter also requires a champion called project champions, which is project champions, who are very good sort of pennant carriers for you. They're the ones who will talk to other people. These are typically executives who will sort of carry their blessings, very much like you. You oftentimes are the ones who can make or break a project. So you carry that forward. So you help create the project charter and assign process assets. Once you're in the project scope management phase, what you're doing there is you begin collecting requirements and then you document all your requirements. The scope is defined by charter 1, assets 2, and requirements 3. Once that's done, now you create your WBS. Once the WBS is created, scope is defined, then you move forward to create project document updates as well as project scope statement, and all of these things are now either stored in your company's database or your project database as project documents, as well as things that you need to ensure are running properly, such as, have you developed a project management plan? Do you know the sequence of activities? Have you properly estimated activity durations? Have you developed a schedule? Do you have a proper planned risk assessment set up? And have you done both a qualitative as well as a quantitative risk analysis? So this shows you a general flowchart of how a project moves from beginning to the creation of certain documents that oftentimes define the workings and the structure of a project. So here's an example of the construction of a house, creating a work breakdown, a scheduler structure uh, based on that. So what we need to understand is, look at the very first bit. It says work altogether needs to be done is 100% and budget is $215,500. Now, in constructing a house, which is adding to all of the 100% would be three things. One would be internal, second would be foundation, third would be external. So internal work would be about 45.6% of the entire project. Foundation work would be about 24% of the entire project, and external work would be about 30.4%. 24% for the entire project. So if you were to add this to the foundation work, to the external work, you should be getting 100%. Now, next question is, in order for internal work to get done, what are the different things that need to be accomplished? First, say, we need to get something electrical done, plumbing done internally. Now, electrical work and plumbing work together would comprise your entire internal work and should be that 45.6%. But together they should, all of these things together, should add up to 100%, but that 100% would constitute 45.6% of the work. So under electrical, you have rough and electrical work done, and so you'll see rough and electrical, install and terminate, HVAC equipment. Altogether constitutes 11.8% of the work, and the budget is $25,000. So it's very easy to calculate. If you say, alright, internal work is 45.6%, you can immediately calculate and say, alright, what's 45.6% of $215,000, which is terminate. HVAC equipment 7%, which is 7.1%, which is about $15,100. Then comes plumbing, similarly, total work 33.8%. Now if you see 33.8% and 11.8%, they total 45.6%. And then under plumbing, you have rough and plumbing, set plumbing fixtures and trim, test and clean, and each carries a particular work percentage, which is 11.3% for that, which is 22,000, 13.2%, 31,000, 9.3%, 8,000, and so on. Next comes foundation. Total work for foundation is 24% of the work would be foundation work, which basically would mean that your budget is 24% of the $215,500, about $46,000. And under that, excavation work is 18.2%, and concrete pouring is about 7.9%. So excavation 18.2% is 37,000. 7.9% is of which 7.9% is pouring concrete, that's 30,000, and the other 7,000 goes towards curing and stripping forms. So that's about 10.3%. So 10.3% and 7.9% creates a total of 18.2%. Similarly, steel erection, total work 5.8%, which is broken down again into steel columns, beams, joist work, each with its own set. Now realize you can keep breaking each into further smaller and smaller, more modular activities. And therefore you'll know, if you were to break down, for example, joisting as the purchase of the joist, the holding of the joist, the installation of the joist, the testing of the joist, each you could break them into smaller and smaller pieces, which therefore gives you a very good notion in terms of how long it's going to take and how much budget each piece would take. So if you have a budget, you can always calculate the time from it. For example, if your budget in this case, so let's look at any budget, and you say, all right, Joy's budget is $2,000. So suppose you say, all right, $2,000 each. Um, all the labor that we need will typically need, um, I don't know, labor that's paid $1.20 per hour to put the joystick. So therefore, you know that, all right, I need 100 hours worth of labor, because 2000 divided by 20 is 100. So you say that I need 100 hours of labor, and if you want 100 hours of labor, you can now say, all right, this is how we're going to structure it. We'll have people working 8 hours every day. So in this case, 8 12s are 90 is 96, and then you're left with 4. There you'll say 12.5 days. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. So once again, once you have the budget, from the budget you can calculate based on hourly wages or something similar the number of hours, and then you can schedule the number of hours across the number of days, and say that, all right, these would be the number of days I'd like to finish it. On the other hand, if you say that, I want to finish it quicker, you'll say that, all right, we're not going to have 8-hour days, instead we're going to have 12-hour days or 16-hour days in 2 shifts, and therefore it's going to be reduced by half, which is going to be 6.25 days to complete your joystick. Then comes external, which is the last piece of the puzzle, which is work altogether, 30.4% of the total work. Budget is 83,500, of which you have masonry work. And masonry work is 16.2% of the set. Laying of the masonry would be 9%. Installation of the roof drains would be 3%, and installation of tiles in toilet rooms would be 1.3%. Roofing would be 2.8%. Building finishes, the other part, 14.2%, so 14.2%, and the laying of and masonry work together 16.4, and so 14.2 and 16.2 together 30.4%, of which you have painting walls, ceiling tiles, hanging wallpaper, carpet, hardwares, and so forth. And suddenly you've got your work breakdown schedule structure, where budget can be converted to time or vice versa. Next, we talk about a very famous process model, very much like what you call as a PMBOK, Project Management Body of Knowledge. There's a very famous process model called Prince 2, and basically shows you the entire, just the way we showed the flow chart of a project. This shows you a more detailed flow chart, talking about what parts of the project belong to the corporate or the program management setup, which ones are there to provide the directions, so that's the direction piece, which ones provide you management, and what are the delivery pieces. And then it starts with the project mandate, or creating the chart itself. And when you start the project, you appoint the executive project manager, capture previous lessons, which is nothing but you look at historical best practices and lessons. So historical best practices as well as worst practices. So things you should avoid, people you should contact, certain things you should run in certain ways. Design and appoint the project management team, prepare the outline business case, select the project approach, and assemble the project brief and plan the initiation stage. Now, do realize this capturing of previous lessons and the appointing of the executive project manager falls under project direction because that's the general guiding principle there. Once you begin designing and appointing the project management team, the outlining of the business case, the project approach, and assembling the project brief and the initiation stage, these are all management issues that you're trying to tackle in the process. Now, as you move forward, what you create out there would be the daily log, the lessons log, the outline of the business case, project, product description, and so forth. For you to, now that you're ready, you send out a request to initiate the project. This request is sent very much like an escalation, and it's sent out to somebody in the direction team or the executive team that will provide you the authorization. Once the authorization is done, you start providing further directions over the entire activities till project closure. And once the authorities received, you initiate a project with a series of activities such as preparing the risk management strategy, the configuration management strategy, which means what needs to be changed, what needs to be reconfigured, and this could even be asset reconfiguration, including human capital reconfiguration. So you can say that I want to look at this person was allocated to this task in this department. I want to reallocate this person somewhere else, which also means it's a configuration management story in the process. Prepare the quality management strategy, the communications management strategy, who reports to whom, when, how, and so forth. Then set up the project controls. That oftentimes would even incorporate things like quality and risk. Create the project plan, refine the business case, assemble the project initiation documentation, and what you create in the process would be all these risk management strategies and project plans, cases. So you're always documenting. The end of every activity ought to be a series of deliverables. Oftentimes these deliverables are either in forms of activities or further activities or documentations as something that you hand over. Then, of course, you get into managing a stage boundary where you look into planning the next stage as you're working on all of these things. You also have to create something called, you need to create exception plans, which is what happens if. Just the way we do decision trees and scenarios, you have to create backups. Every backup is basically an exception. So every scenario, every if, then is basically nothing but an exception. And you have to prepare your project to follow those exceptions very well. So you plan the next stage, update the project plan, update the business case, report stage, and produce an exception plan. And you update the project ID with all of these things, which is basically the project implementation database or something similar. Basically the project database with all of these important things, some updated and some created. As you move through these activities, you're authorizing work packages, reviewing work packages, completing work packages. I'll mention it again, very important to stay modular, because the smaller the work packages are, the quicker it is for you to notice problems in certain issues or with certain issues and immediately create solutions or create better exception plans. Then review the stage status, request highlights, capture and examine issues and risks, escalate issues and risks, take corrective actions until you finish all your activities and go into closing a project, where you plan the project closure, prepare for premature closure, hand over products, evaluate the project, recommend closure, and a proper handoff. At this point, the most important bit is you ensure that there is a transition. Don't do a solid cutoff. Do a phased transition instead. Try something called a phased transition. Move the project slowly into what you're planning to re-engineer or change or accommodate or make better. And as you do it, transition it slowly into the process. Then, of course, comes these things in terms of balancing effective project choice versus efficient project administration. You've got to figure out, and this is a very important piece of the puzzle, you've got to figure out what defines an effective project, which is something that will actually provide you the proper benefits, versus efficient project administration, which is everything's running smoothly, except for the fact that when things are done, you realize, well, this project really doesn't accomplish what I wanted it to accomplish. I wonder why. Oftentimes, it's mainly because what you wanted to achieve was not very well defined, but you've created your work breakdown structure and schedule so well that you've achieved it. It's like you've built the entire house, except for the fact that after the house is built, you realize that isn't the house I wanted in the first place. I'd rather have a different house. Did I just spend all the time and money building this house? Perhaps what I should have looked at would have been a better envisioning from the architectural plans on what the house ought to look like. So there are these opportunity costs, which is the cost of choosing efficiency over effectiveness. Now do realize effectiveness reduces risk. So effectiveness reduces risk, increases quality, but also increases cost and time. So it's very important for you to choose these things carefully. Efficiency and effectiveness are two different things. So we need to rely on proper metrics to ensure that we're gauging what we wanted to gauge in the very first place. If we can't gauge them very well, if we don't know what to measure, we will never know how to make certain things better. So when you're running, so it's a good idea is to make sure that your project is thought of as a portfolio. And in that portfolio, you're running across many things, including the control, right? Which would be deliverables. That's where you need your proper metrics. What are the deliverables? Not only what are the deliverables, but are these deliverables modular? So you need modularity and metrics that define your deliverables. Next is planned versus actual costs. What are your planned costs? What are your actual costs? What happens when your actual costs tend to be heading further and further upwards and surpassing your planned costs? How do you kill that project? Do you keep that project active? This is a very important piece in terms of understanding and factoring what you would define as whether you can create cost controls right from the start of the project. If you know your cost controls, as we talked about previously, for example, things such as uncertainty increase the likelihood of higher costs. So your actual costs are likely to be higher than planned costs unless you plan in the uncertainty and raise your cost structure, factor in that uncertainty into that process. Then suddenly you have less of a sticker shock, time shock, and cost shock. And then, of course, benefits management. Who gets paid, when, how, at what rate, bonuses, and so forth. The second part of the portfolio is efficiency, which is, can we maintain it in terms of role-based demand, which is, would there be certain people, certain roles in the project whose demands would fluctuate? You might need a certain person at a certain time, another person at a different time. You might need somebody who's an integrator later on during the project versus somebody who's a designer or cost control specialist early on in the project. So you have to decide when you're going to demand what kind of role. The second is capacity planning. You need to know how to handle capacity. What happens if something gets late? What happens if suddenly you have too many requests coming in? Suddenly if you spot too many errors? What happens if you have too few people on at a job site or the project site or at an activity? Too many of them. Based on your capacity planning and your role-based demand, you should conduct your scheduling very prudently. So you should schedule them knowing exactly when somebody is required and when somebody is not. Remember, every hour costs your project a money. So if you're over allocating or under allocating, so over allocation or under allocation can create costs. Then comes visibility. Your project has to be transparent. A transparent project is always a project that has less resistance and greater executive championship and buy-in. Firstly, you have to understand your projects, programs, portfolios. Once again, modularity allows you to create quick outcomes from inputs, which means that people who are spending money on the project, whether it's your client, whether it's your internal business venture, whether it's a process owner, is always happier to say, all right, I can see quick deliverables. But you have to run it across projects, programs, and portfolios. Resource utilization, show who's been used when. You can chart it out. You can have WBS elements very well performed. You can have matrices that would show which resources being used when, at what part of the during what time of the project. And then real time and fully integrated. Make sure that you show people how the integration is going to happen and show it to them, sometimes real time, sometimes quick, but maybe not absolutely on the fly. Because you sometimes want to make sure that things are going all right before you show things and do error checks and corrections before it's presented. So how you run that, whether it's going to be real time or a store and forward, but make sure that the periodicity is very short and the idea that it's completely integrated. And finally comes governance. Governance is making sure that you constantly creating project status reports, documentation, followed by who are you sending these documentations to? Who should you keep informed? Who should you consult with? This goes back into the RACI matrix, which is responsible, accountable, consulted, informed. Who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, and who's informed. Keep the people responsible on their toes, keep the ones accountable in the knowledge, keep the ones consulted in the loop, and keep the people who are informed constantly fed with the right data from modular project setups. Then the next one is create a very structured approach. Make sure that everybody knows who receives what, when, and how. How do you access something? When do you find the latest information? You need to ensure that there's a structure assigned to it. And the third one is scenario modeling. Understand scenario modeling in terms of decision trees. What happens if we do this versus something else? What is the probability of something happening? Whether it's a risk probability, resource probability, quality probability, cost probability. What are the ramifications? If something happens, then what else can happen? So all you're doing is you're creating a series of scenarios with a multiplicity of activities and considerations that you need to put in play. So once again, your project portfolio has to focus on project control, project efficiency, project visibility, project governance. Make sure your projects are modular, they have metrics, and guide your projects based on understanding the opportunity costs between effectiveness and efficiency. An effective project is what you want, but an effective project is likely to cost you more. An efficient project might meet all the parameters, all the deadlines on time, but perhaps you end up delivering something that you realize is not exactly what you or your client wanted. So, to finish off, if you look at the success drivers, the percentage of projects meeting original goals and business intent using various practices. Say that the highest number of success or the most success drivers, the most important one is the project must have active sponsors on most projects, which is there's somebody who's always championing the project. At least 80% of your projects should have champions. Have 35% or over 35% of project managers certified with something like a PMP, and of course do realize this comes from the project PMP guideline. So the good thing about having a PMP or understanding the inner bits about PMP, a lot of what is based on what we've even covered, is you have a sense of what to do, when to do, how to run something properly. That's 72%. Using risk management, which is getting more and more important every single day. Then using a portfolio management approach. Using standardized project management practices so that it creates easier inheritance. Somebody else comes in to work for you or work on your behalf, or comes into the project. If you have very good standardized project management practices that you use, you don't have to worry about whether there's any kind of dissonance, any kind of confusion, or anything like that. Have a career path for those in project management. Use change management very well. Know that if you're building something, a project is basically a change. That's why you have a project, because you want to change something that your company is doing or your client was doing, and you want to come up with a better solution. In order to create the better solution, you come up with a project. So you need to understand both qualitative aspects of change management, such as motivation, ensuring satisfaction, making sure that there are intrinsic elements that will drive people to succeed, to do things better, as well as more quantitative bits in terms of compensation, scheduling issues, scheduled conflict understanding, and so forth. Then have a formal process for developing program or project manager competency that define metrics in terms of what defines a competent project manager. So create proper metrics. Have a formal process to mature existing practices, which is, can you translate good practices into best practices and standard operating procedures that lead to SOPs. Use agile project management, and agile, of course, deals with modularity. Make sure things are modular. Make sure things are quick. Make sure you can see deliverables, create more deliverables, shorter periods, greater frequency, so that it increases transparency, increases control, increases efficiency, and increases governance. And lastly, have a project management office, which is have a dedicated office that runs a project management group. so that they'll have the best practices ready with them. They do the proper documentation. You can use best practices across projects and so forth. Thank you very much